Kia ora, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Photo.
Cheers. Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to the session hosted by Kogo. I'm Brian Johnston, Head of Impact at Kogo. I just want to say a few short things around safety and around toilets for those that are here. So if there's an earthquake, we need to drop cover and hold, and if there's a long earthquake, then we're going to have to head out to an evacuation point. And there are toilets on either side of the lifts, and if you need to use the conveniences, then ask, I think, Marcus, at least at this stage, he's behind the screen, so he can share a pass. And pass over to John.
Kia ora. Thanks, Brian. Kia ora koutou katoa. Nā mo haere mai. Ko hone tēnei. Welcome. My name's John. It's a pleasure to be emceeing this event tonight around decarbonisation and data. I'm pretty comfortable that I'm going to learn quite a bit tonight because it's not a deep area for me. So really looking forward to enjoying the conversation, and please, if you're online, I believe there's folks there, there are opportunities for you to ask questions. If you just put those in the chat function that you're viewing this through, we have someone who will ensure that those are answered as we go. So first order of business to introduce the team. I'll get you to just give a quick overview of yourselves. So Christine, Jason, Bernadette, Brian, welcome, and perhaps if you can open up about who you are and what your particular aspect of data and decarbonisation is that you're looking to share with us tonight.
Perfect, thanks. Hi everyone, my name is Christine. I work at ThinkStep ANZ. We are a team of 50 people spread around Australia and New Zealand, and our mission is to help organizations to succeed sustainably. So what we're doing is assessing environmental impacts, and we also do strategic work around sustainability. And in my day-to-day work, I prepare carbon footprints of organizations of all varieties. I help them to set science-based targets and pathways to achieve them. So that really is from Lord to Singer to the Reserve Bank. So we have a real variety around that. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm Jason Kibbe. I'm the CEO of HIG. We are a sustainability insights platform for the consumer goods industry. And we collect data from factories, from brands, from retailers, and on products and materials. And we look at essentially the large challenges upstream of producing outsourced consumer goods, and really trying to figure out how do you go deeper into value chains, deeper into materials, to figure out scope 3 emissions, but also to look much more broadly at all of the impacts of producing goods in an outsourced, distributed, global value chain system.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Bernadette Casey, one of the founders of Usefully, and we work specifically in the textile space. The last couple of years we've been co-designing the circular economy or textile circular economy with industry, and then implementing the parts. And from a data perspective, we've got a platform that members of our program use to measure and track and understand the impacts of their products from across the whole value chain, so from procurers and users and end-of-life processes. So that's me.
Thanks, Bernadette. Kia ora koutou. I'm Brian Johnston from Kogo. I'm the Head of Impact, as probably mentioned just before. Kogo is a sustainability fintech, and what we do is we primarily are working with banks and accountancy providers, cloud-based accountancy providers, to help them to help their users, so individuals as well as small and medium enterprises, to understand their footprint, their carbon footprint in particular, and to understand which actions they could be taking and the significance of those actions, all through spend-based data and merging that with carbon data. So yeah, great to be together with this panel and expecting a good discussion.
Fantastic. Well, it's truly global. We've got the USA represented, Germany, New Zealand. Really wanted to open something up, I guess, a quick fire question for all of you, just a brief perspective on this is I would hesitate from outside the industry, quite a trend at the moment. I mean, I see carbon in many headlines across many things online and in print almost every day now. I think the point here is just to try and expand some elements of fact and where we're actually going to get some real perspective and probably most importantly some real action. So from each of your perspective, just for a brief sort of reflection, what are the trends that you see in the carbon data space at the moment? Perhaps starting with you, Brian.
Yeah, great. Part of a big focus of our work is around supporting banks these days, around bringing those products to help their end users to understand and navigate and try to reduce their carbon footprint. So we're definitely seeing trend across banks in terms of both regulation. Regulation is increasing around disclosures and around Scope 3 emissions reporting, which means the emissions outside of their direct operations. And of course, particularly within that space, it's the financed emissions. So their loan books, essentially, they're having to track the kind of carbon impact of those loans at a cumulative basis. Therefore, they have to kind of understand the carbon footprint of the businesses or the individuals that they're lending to. So that's definitely a big trend. There's also greenwashing, and probably others will talk to that in a bit more detail, but we definitely see that as well. And that's from the perspective of, what are the most material components of your carbon footprint with that broader scope of not just direct operations, but who you're working with and who's in the value chain, suppliers and so forth. That stuff is really important, and that the banks need to be showing it, taking action in that space to be credible as well. So that's probably a couple of key ones for us.
Cool, thank you, Brian. Bernadette.
Well, from a textile specific point of view, often when we think of textiles and clothing, we think about what we personally wear, but government is the single largest procurer of textiles in New Zealand. When you think of all the hospitals, the prisons, all the uniforms of our frontline force, so the need for government agencies to meet net zero, there's pressure on government agencies, so they're wanting to understand their footprint. And then from the supply side, from the commercial suppliers, their customers are wanting to understand, or they want to know what the footprint is of what's been supplied to them. So the commercial uniform suppliers are getting requests every week now from people like in New Zealand or whoever the customer is. Okay, you're supplying these goods, but what is the impact of those? So there's a pull from their customers for that information.
That sounds encouraging, and we'll come back to regulation as well, because I think it plays a big part. Jason?
What we're seeing is companies, and as the world really starts to recognize the impacts of climate change, that we've seen a lot of commitments to do things like science-based targets and to live within a 1.5 degree world. And I think what a lot of the companies and institutions that started to do that didn't really realize is that in order to actually manage that, in order to reach that place where we can live within a 1.5 degree world, we need a lot of data, and we need to actually understand our impacts. And most importantly, I think both Brian and Bernadette have talked about it, we need to understand upstream impacts, because often, especially in the making of goods, the biggest impacts don't happen in the offices of the places where the designers are working, or they don't happen even with the transportation of those goods. It's really upstream in the supply chains and in the making of materials that actually creates that impact. And I think what we're seeing is that carbon data is really a new gold, as essentially the management of carbon, the reduction of emissions becomes a normal part of doing business, just like accounting or legal. And in order to do that, you need lots and lots of data. So I think this is not a trend. I think this is actually here to stay, just in the way that accounting standards 50 or 75 years ago aren't a trend. They're something that's now fundamental to do the way that we do business. I think we're going to see the same, especially for the harder to reach upstream data that's been pretty elusive to date.
Interesting. Christine, your view.
Well, I can support what was said really. So what we are seeing with our clients is just that there's a really high demand of good quality data, especially in the value chain, because it's easier for organizations to know what's happening in their own operations, and harder, as you said already, to get the information throughout your supply chain. So I think it's really encouraging to see that there's really high demand, and on the point of setting targets, we know where we need to get to, but the how to get there is really where we need the data.
Very good. I'm going to straw poll here because it's a multi-country audience. Data or data? What am I going to use?
Potato, potato.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I just want some consistency. How do we say that, Brian?
I think I tend
There's
to
no
say-
right answer, by the
Yeah,
way.
I say data, I think, but I'm out of step.
Data and Kiwi, Bernadette.
I'll switch to data if you guys want.
Oh, what a champion. Sort of a
Thanks,
What about in Germany? What is it? Data.
Data.
Data. Okay, right. Well, that's easy. So when we talk about data, and this one, I might bounce to you first, Christine. There's data obviously that comes from measurement and some elements, but then there's also the scientific side of things. What's your view on how those things intersect? What's important and around this journey to decarbonisation? As you said, the key thing is actually to get moving on execution and getting some change. How do those two elements between science and the data from other sources actually come together?
Yeah, now, it's a really important point because we want to have our data aligned with science. So we really think when you're looking at environmental impacts like emissions, you really need to align with latest science. And in terms of emissions and decarbonizations, we're relying on data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so the IPCC, which just regularly provides really high quality data. I think it's really important to have that in mind when we're looking at reduction targets, so emission reduction targets, that we also align these with the latest science so that we set the targets in line with where we need to get and not with what we can do. So there is an institution called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which provides guidance and translates the climate science from IPCC into methodology on how an organization, a company can set their targets and ensure that they're aligned with science. I think that's really important. And maybe to add on that, because science is one side of the thing, but I think the other side that's important is aligning it with best practice standards as well, to ensure that the data that we're looking at and the outcomes are comparable and transparent, and in the end also credible, which allows us then to verify it against a standard in line with science.
I might add on to this. There's an interesting debate going on right now. You probably see this in your work between sort of primary data and average data. And that there's a lot of desire to get the primary data, which I think is what everyone recognizes. We really want to understand if you're buying a t-shirt, really what is the carbon footprint of that t-shirt? But today we can't actually get there. We can't easily just sort of figure that out for every t-shirt on the planet. And so we have to sometimes rely on these averages. And we're in this interesting moment where we have to do that in order to make better decisions to reduce our carbon emissions. But we also have to recognize that every year the quality of the data and the depth of the data and the veracity of primary data has to improve. And so we're in this awkward moment where we don't really have the data that we need to be perfect and to make sure that we're making the decisions that we can make forever. But we have to essentially sometimes go with imperfect data so that we can move forward as that data quality improves. Did you like my use of data? Did I pass?
It was a brilliant use of data and a beautiful segue into a question for you, Jason.
Sure.
Because you've had a lot of experience around brands, very large brands with HIG and Sustainable Apparel Coalition. And I want to talk a little bit and get people's views on transparency, because the data potentially is there and the quality is increasing, but how it's presented, I guess, is a challenge.
Oh, no, it's a great question. And I think this is, there are two sort of big open questions right now. The first is that how do you use data and information to change consumer behavior so that essentially they can buy more sustainable products and reduce the impacts through their purchases? And I think that's one open question. And that I think there's still you and I were speaking about this, John, before the panel. No one has figured out perfectly how to do that. And there's a lot of innovation that needs to happen to figure out what's really going to move the needle so that people choose the more sustainable product. That hasn't happened yet. On the flip side, you have this delicacy, so you need innovation. On the flip side, you also have this challenge where it's easy for consumers to be confused. It's easy to maybe oversimplify things, or it's easy sometimes you only have information on one attribute of a product's impact, and that's what you might talk about. And could that be misleading? Potentially. And so regulators have come in and said, essentially gone pretty hard against greenwashing, which I think there are some very good reasons for this. There have been a lot of claims that have been made that have no substantiation whatsoever. However, there is also this counterbalance which says we need to innovate, we need to learn what's actually going to make people choose more sustainable products. I think we're in an awkward moment right now where essentially there had been too much greenwashing in general. Regulators swooped in and sort of pushed hard against that. And that has already started to slow innovation to see how do we actually present information in ways that move consumer behavior towards more sustainable products. I think we're going to see regulation in this and guidance over the coming years. But I think we're in this moment right now where after a lot of experimentation and putting information out there about more sustainable products, now the general sentiment is that pull back until there's regulatory essentially clarity on what should happen. So I don't think we're going to see a lot over the next few years in terms of good sustainability communication until that regulation is clear.
I mean, I think awkward moments probably a good expression. I mean, is anyone finding the irony that I did in COP27 being sponsored by Coca-Cola? It kind of tells you there's a bit of a disconnect between what's trying to be achieved and who needs to change behaviour to achieve it. But story for another day, I'm sure. And I wanted to pick up on that regulatory and policy aspect with you, Brian, get a perspective, and perhaps Bernadette, you're seeing it a lot also early in New Zealand and the work you've done around product stewardship. So I'll come to you after Brian. But banking, financial services, that's probably one of the first industries that, from a regulatory and policy point of view, I think, and I'm interested in your view, has actually got some teeth to the elements. What do you see?
Yeah, I mean, the regulation is coming in New Zealand, and it's also in place in a number of other countries as well. But what's in New Zealand is stronger at the moment, in a number of ways, is going to lead to, well, a lot of the banks are scratching their heads and looking into figuring out what it means for them, what they actually need to disclose, and how on earth they go ahead with measuring some of these things, let alone influencing. So this is not uncommon, compared to other corporates that would be out there in other industries. But what it will lead to is, depending on how the regulation is structured in each country, then that drives a certain type of behavior. And while we, as Kogo can sort of benefit from that increased kind of interest, it's just one of the factors which is of relevance, I think, because we also very much want to engage around that proactive space. So the regulation will, in terms of social license to operate, I think is helping to strengthen on that side for the financial industry. We can help banks with that, but actually where we can help the most is help them to help their customers to build up their carbon literacy as well. So everyone's, I guess, learning at the same time in a way. The regulation is in a really important component in many cases, but it's just, it's the carrot and the stick. You kind of need a bit of both. And when a regulation is defined, then how it rolls out in practice in terms of how organizations react to it and how much checking or compliance there is and the efficiency of that as well. I hope that there's some, open eyes there to see that it's actually achieving the outcomes that they're after.
Bernadette, you've been working with the usefully team with government departments on product stewardship and preparing for that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really interesting space. Textiles, New Zealand's late to becoming aware of the impacts of textiles. Europe's, a decade in front of us, even Australia's ahead of us. So we haven't prioritised textiles, and they have got hugely outsized impacts, which we know from the research. Places like Auckland Council, they've now prioritised textiles. So it's the information like the research and the data that comes through influences that policy making, and then if that informs, like if a product becomes a priority product, then that gets the funding, attention, and the support it needs for better outcomes. So it's really important in how we approach these things, and having that information, because we've got such a short period of time, like the scientists are saying, we've only got 5 years before we, sorry to be the doom and gloom guy, but only 5 years till we blow that 1.5 degree budget. So we've got to move fast on the things that are most impactful, and we need the research and we need the data to understand what those are.
If we think, just extending on that a bit about focus and the lens that we look at this around, Do we have the right lens? Is it a single lens? How are we looking at this, and what needs to change to see more progress?
It's using the right frame. I mean, there's so many different frameworks that you work with. God, what do you work with? What's the framework you use? Cost-based? No, spend-based or spend-based, and then and then there's activity-based accounting, and there's so many different frameworks that you can use. So you need to be, well, that's what consultants do. They help you get across what is the right framework for your organisation to achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve.
The circular economy is a great example, I think, because it's getting a lot more interest, and we all know that we use too many resources and only use them often one time, and then they disappear, when actually there are cycles that could be really stimulated and supported. But if you go in purely on a carbon lens, a carbon footprint lens, for example, then you won't pick up some of the benefits of reusing, repurposing, bringing things back in a cycle. So yeah, there is a danger in adopting one single lens. On the other hand, we collectively, I guess, make a lot more progress if we prioritize in some way. And I'm sure that's an example of something with the Higg Index as well, has had to kind of grapple with. Is some people, some organizations, some regulations will be really focused on just carbon, and is it only carbon that matters? Clearly not, but how do we balance off all of that, back to your earlier point too, around confusing the end user around what to do?
Yeah, and potentially the business too. And I guess a question starting with you, Christine, and for any contribution from the panel as well. I mean, what are businesses at the moment really focused around carbon and data, and what are they trying to achieve similar things in terms of the outcomes we're talking about, or where do you think they're at stage-wise?
Yeah, so what we're seeing our clients wanting to get out of carbon data is mainly two things. They want to understand where they're sitting, as in, what are the main contributions to my carbon footprint as an organization or of my specific product. And the second thing is they want data to make good decisions. So if we have a different range of materials that we can use in the design phase of our product, which is the best one? What is the best packaging material that we can use? So I think maybe I can give a couple of examples from the work that we've done. We've just been working with a manufacturer in New Zealand, and they wanted to understand how much of the transport emissions they can save by moving their manufacturing from New Zealand to the United States, where their market is. And we assessed it, and we found out that they could save around 70% of their transport emissions. We are working with a framework called life cycle assessment, where we're trying to look at the whole life cycle of a specific product, or also applicable to a corporate carbon footprint across the whole value chain, what we've just discussed earlier. So we've also looked at what were the emissions from extracting the raw material of their product, transporting it, manufacturing it, and then the in-use phase, because it was an electronic product that used some electricity, and then the disposal at the end of the life. What we found was that transport only made 3% of the total carbon footprint. So while they could reduce a little bit out of this 3%, the 90% came from the in-use phase. Wow. So understanding where maybe we put our attention to and our efforts for carbon reduction just helps when we're looking at the whole life cycle. And maybe a second example, just from a different study that we did with New Zealand Post. They have courier bags made of virgin plastic, and we're just getting a little bit of consumer pressure, right? That's what we're hearing, like plastic bags for their courier bags. So they wanted to explore alternatives. We looked at paper bags of similar size and quality, home compostable bags, and recycled plastic. And what we found in terms of emissions was that the recyclable bags actually had the lowest impacts across the whole life cycle again. Which is maybe something that intuition or our gut feel wouldn't really tell us. So it is really important in terms of data to use it when we make decisions and when we're trying to assess our biggest impacts. And I think that's really where organizations are interested in. And the better the data, the better the decision that we can make based on it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And this question, I'll start with you, Jason, is really around the consumer side of that. Obviously, businesses are businesses. They're there to make profits. There's more of a turn. Sadly, it still seems fairly early around being perhaps more purposeful as well as profitable.
Yep.
But in the work that you've done, particularly in the fashion sector, because there is so much importance and trends, and the fashion itself is a personal sort of reflection of self. What have you seen around consumers around decarbonisation and where they're prioritising what they want to see out of businesses?
I think back to some comments that we made earlier, that it's very hard for the consumers to really understand this. And the place that we're seeing it the most, and I think the only place that right now is working credibly, is really looking overall at the perception and values of the brand and seeing what brands are doing at a macro level. Because if you put consumers in front of the same products or two different products that are similar, but maybe are made out of different materials, and you try to get them to understand which one is more sustainable, they might be surprised by the results, and they might actually reject those results if they're a surprise to them and they don't fit with their intuition. And so what we have seen, and what I think is starting to emerge that is actually a powerful driver, is really how is the brand as a whole perceived? And that perception in the market is actually driving a lot of investment. And so those brands that are perceived as damaging to the planet or not treating their workers well, those tend to be the brands now that are starting to say, how do I change? And how do I invest to improve my value chain? I mean, I think a good example recently, H&M is often sort of seen as a poster child for fast fashion in the marketplace and amongst activist organizations. And they're investing $300 million in decarbonization in their supply chain. That's a significant investment and change. And I think that is partially this push and pull from the brands and the impacts and the way that brands are perceived, and then what they end up really having to do on the ground.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it is people and planet, isn't it? And particularly with something like fashion, you've got all these other ethical and I think 1 in 9 people is employed in the fashion supply chain in the world.
That
Really?
That might be a little high, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
There are a lot of, unfortunately, in this space, there are a lot of factoids that don't have much basis in fact, that are shared quite widely. Like fashion industry is the second most polluting industry in the world. This is certainly one of them. But yes, there are many people, regardless of if it's 1 in 9. It is still in probably the tens, if not maybe even low hundreds of millions of people.
But this is the key issue, isn't it? Is when these data sets and so forth get taken out of context. Exactly. Or expanded. The other classic one I've heard is the how many litres of water it takes.
2,300 in a.
I've heard as high as 25,000. I mean, it just it's really sort of making an impression, isn't it?
It's very easy to add a zero accidentally. And it happens all the time.
So probably start with you on this one, Brian. But I'm sure everyone has a perspective. And what is a consumer or a business really? Can we put, let's say, out of 10 as we go around in terms of trust in carbon data and the point we've got to?
Based on where things are at right now, I guess it's a bit of a non-answer, but I'd say there's a really big challenge around literacy, or understanding what it is that's being communicated, and we see this all the time because we help with our products being integrated into banking platforms that often they're asking, can we give some equivalencies to help people to understand what is a kilogram, a ton of carbon, what does that kind of look like or feel like, how far driving in a petrol-based vehicle is that, or how many trees is that, and then what does that mean if you're actually saying it in that way? But it helps people to understand in terms of context. So we've realized that the journey in terms of getting the data out there is as much about getting the numbers out there as explaining the context around those numbers. And then, of course, trust is and transparency a really big element as well. And that people need enough information to be able to make these decisions. So the data that's available right now is, I guess, given the level of literacy, looking at sort of individuals out there from our perspective is reasonable. It's definitely enough for people to start to understand hotspots, where parts of their lifestyle, where the carbon emissions are greatest. We really focus as much as we can on a sort of an indicative footprint. So is the data good enough to give people an idea to get them to start engaging around actions, because to Bernadette's point around timing, we all need to start taking action as much as we can. That's reasonable. Of course, there's some challenges around that, but let's just talk about the data.
Well, that's going to be my question again to yourselves, and I'll come back to that sort of, cleverly didn't answer the trust sort of 1 out of 10 there. It might be one of those sort of comfort with the uncomfort side of things. But it is early, and I guess just really trying to find some elements of optimism around what we are seeing that looks like it's actually connecting and progressing. Christine, what from your side of things, what would you say is give us some hope?
Yeah, no, I think I'm really hopeful around the fact that what we're seeing in executive and on a board level, the literacy actually is increasing. Like, people understand the wording around emissions. They know what scope 1, 2, and 3 is, which is really encouraging. So having people understand how emissions work and how inventories work, I think that's really what makes me optimistic. And then having more people trying to use standardized emissions counting also is something that I think makes me really optimistic, because when using them, you can validate against them, and then the trust increases when you have an external assurance maybe against the numbers that you're disclosing. So I guess to your point, Jason, yeah, maybe it cuts innovation a little bit due to the whole greenwashing, but maybe it increases also that the numbers that are put out are actually a higher quality, because people are a little bit more cautious with aligning with standards, best practice, and science. Yeah.
Bernadette, what have you seen that's optimistic around this?
I feel really optimistic. The fact that we're starting to measure where resources are, it will connect through to living within that planetary boundary, and I think about the futurists that I've read, and like years ago they were saying that we'd move away from a world that was built on concrete and oil and coal and steel into a place where it's photons and neutrons and molecules. And I think just starting to, from a broader perspective, if we're starting to measure carbon, we're starting to measure atoms, and we're starting to work at that level, I think we're really taking a big step forward towards that. Yeah.
Brian? Oh, sorry, Jason.
I think so. When I finished business school about 15 years ago, if you had told me we would be in this place where every large business is thinking about carbon, everyone, this is a normal engagement, where the hottest investment sector right now in all of technology investing is in climate tech and is in impact reduction, that things like benefit corporations would become normal. If you told me that we were this far, I wouldn't have believed it in 2022. That being said, I think we're still probably 10 years behind where we would have ideally liked to have been for given the severity of the planetary crisis. But I'm given hope by the speed of acceleration, even just in the last 3 to 5 years, has been radical. And that excites me. And I think that we are seeing an exponential increase in awareness, in activities, and I think if we are able to see this exponential curve in technology innovation and so many different things that are moving really fast right now, if that continues, then we're going to be okay. And that is what gives me hope.
Good.
Can I throw one more piece of hope?
Absolutely.
Parts of the textile industry are very old and traditional, and we feel like some parts are kind of dragging them along. And recently we're having them come and say, ring us and ask for information and really start front-footing it. And that's what gives me hope. And I think, when those crusty old men start bringing you up. I'm sorry, crusty old men. But that's what's giving me hope. Just that leap forward from these really staid traditional companies. Yeah.
Yeah, from my side, I think there's a growing awareness around embodied carbon, so that everything's got a carbon footprint, and the understanding that it's not just burning fuel that you see directly or you're directly involved in, or having the lights on and using electricity, but there's stuff that happens out of sight. So I think people intrinsically understand that, but it's easy to kind of not look into it. And the innovations around technology that have enabled, something like what we're doing these days, that's off the back in the UK of open banking frameworks, which we're off the back of a number of other innovations. And we're also, we're working with these big organizations, these banks in the financial industry that, not that many years ago, you would have not have expected to be reaching out and engaging. And yes, large organizations of any type, they move slowly, but, there's action and there's interest and momentum all across the spectrum, I think, which gives me hope.
Good. Well, we're going to try and stay on that positive curve, that positive vibe, and perhaps ask our audience here or online, do you have any questions of the panel? Burning questions. Ideally positive, but look, it's an open forum, so you can kind of throw anything out there.
We've got information about the data. So apologies for being late. Cancelled buses and trains and couldn't get up here from the lift downstairs. So we're getting, like you say, the data and stuff, and the industry and not-for-profits engaging. But the story I keep hearing from some people is we're waiting, and you've mentioned a bit on technology, for other technologies to be available by 2030. My question to some people is, what are you going to do if that technology is not available? So what are you doing now towards 2030 in the hope that some of that stuff may help you go past 2030?
Great question.
Do you think that was picked up, Marcus? Should we repeat the question?
Who wants to have a crack at a view on that?
Well, I'll have a go. Just from our perspective, there's a huge amount of work to be done, and it was positive to see action, like I mentioned, across the spectrum. But yeah, the speed of that and the ambition of that, still have to kind of wait and see whether it's fast enough. But we're focused at the moment with the actions that we suggest to users and things around things that they can do, behavior that they can change. But we're not, even with a personal footprint and trying to put it out to individuals to engage and think about that, we're not saying that that's all down to them. There are definitely some system change elements there. And yeah, at this stage, with the scale of what we need to engage and try to drive, we've just focused on that part. But yeah, I'll acknowledge that there are some other pretty big issues to solve in time, which we're not directly looking at in much detail just right now.
I'll throw out, I think that there's in anything that you're looking to decarbonize or improve the impacts, there's plenty to do today. There's plenty to do tomorrow. We don't need to, if we wait for the technology to save us, it'll be too late. And I do think that we just need to get off the finish line, or get off the starting line, and actually start doing the hard work of decarbonization and making these decisions. And a lot of it still is low-hanging fruit. It's still things that can be done relatively easily without massive changes or disruption to business or to our lives, and that those things need to be done now.
It is interesting, isn't it, that we sort of fall, it's a great question. We fall to technology now quite regularly to solve all of our problems, but we talk in a number of ventures I'm involved in about responsibility meeting accountability. But that's not just for companies. It's actually the consumers who, and we were talking about this earlier, have a lot of the power, but arguably, and interested in other perspectives, don't wield or yield it in anything like the capacity that they could before you even get into technology and solving those sorts of things.
I live in California, and in California, you can, today, it's very easy to switch your power source to be entirely carbon-free for your home. You can get massive rebates on changing out things like heat pumps for how you heat and cool your home. You can get very significant rebates for things like your hot water heaters. It's very easy to drive an electric car. There are plenty of options for reducing your meat consumption. You can decide to fly less. All of these things are within our control right now, and just even that inventory that I gave could probably reduce one's emissions by 60 or 70 or 80%.
Totally, yeah.
And so I think that's where, and that's the same often for businesses. Sometimes there's embedded infrastructure that takes a lot more capital to change, but for a lot of it, you can make changes today. And I think what we're starting to see is businesses are recognizing that, but there's still a lot more to be done.
Just one for a quick whip around on that, around, you know, the various perspectives you have about decarbonisation and the data side. If there was one thing that you could kind of wave a magic wand, and you've been in your various endeavours looking at and saying, if only this was here now and available now, what would that be? Maybe starting with Brian and working our way around.
Well, we would love to, because the data that we leverage primarily is around whole of economy data with carbon emissions tied into that, and we would love to see trustworthy, credible data at company level that's transparent, and even down to product level, and be able to really connect things up and enable people to make decisions and see, not just if they bought secondhand fashion instead of new fashion, for example, where we can give people a pretty good idea of how much they could reduce there, but actually if they shopped at this brand or this recycled brand or this, fashion rental brand, how much things would change. That would be, that's our goal. We would love to be, we're watching and we're hoping that things are moving that way. And I think they will, but when?
Bernadette, the if only question.
Finally, what I'd love to see, Brian has heard me bang on about this for so long, is that individualisation of responsibility that I feel is really unfair, and that I'd really like to see organisations step up, and instead of when they talk about the efforts that they're making, it's always in siloed or individual companies. And what I'd like to see is for organisations to kind of lift the weight of responsibility from the individuals and say, let's do this together. That's the kind of communication, because sometimes, the climate crisis and the messaging that we get and we are in a crisis, it can be quite overwhelming. And then to have the weight of it all being on your own shoulders, I think that messaging around shared responsibility, that would change a lot in my head anyway. Yeah.
Jason?
I think two things. I would say high quality scope 3 data, so that we actually knew where the emissions were coming from upstream. And ultimately, maybe to build on what you were saying, I'd love to see data that's high enough quality so that we can price the cost of these externalities into products, into services, into everything that we do, so that we actually can be faced with essentially the impacts that we're making as we're actually deciding how to do it.
Christine?
I'd also need to pick two. I think mine would be that environmental data and emission data is treated the same way as financial data in terms of accuracy and just how systems are built within companies. And the second one is maybe also on what Bernadette said. It's just that we collaborate more in order to get that good data. So engage with suppliers, engage within industries to just make whatever was already learned available to peers.
Interesting. Folks, I think we're sort of moving towards wrap, and if you've got any other questions, there's a few minutes to ask those.
I have
Thank you.
a few. Let's say you have a perfect data set of everything that you need lands in your desk. What then? What changes?
Oh, what Christine said, I'd share it, because knowledge is power.
My question, that's a good answer, but that's what you would do next. My question is, what changes? How does that reduce?
Have everyone got what they were wishing for in terms of that perfect data set?
You've got what you want. How does that help you? How does it help the world or your customers reduce their carbon?
I think it ultimately allows for the accountability to, if we all believe that we want to live in a 1.5 degree world, and that we all want to be a part of the solutions making that happen, then we could all, with the perfect data and with actually the full information, we can know, am I doing that myself, my company, my city, my country? And we can hold ourselves accountable to that. And right now, I think a lot of the challenge is that there are many companies that are setting science-based targets, and they're wondering, like, am I doing the right thing? I don't even know. How can I show that? And there's no accountability mechanism because it's really hard to actually pin that down. But with that perfect data set, I think could create an accountability mechanism that we don't have today that could actually really determine, are we doing what we need to do to live in that 1.5 degree world?
Okay, I have 3 more questions, if I may. Here's a very simplified scenario. I go into the supermarket and I buy some grapes, and they have a red light on them because they come from Chile. And the avocados that come from the Wairarapa have a green light. And that would influence my buying behavior. Would that be a typical outcome of this perfect data? And you can extrapolate that up to a company level, or you could extrapolate that up to concrete and steel and wood, etc.
Yeah, I think if if you've got highly granular, accurate data, then communicating all of that to your audience is, confusion will reign, or just like paralysis by too much information. So yeah, simplification in the right way for communication is really important, but there's always the assumptions around that, and the need for the right type of organization to have a view on that and have checked that it's, because the simplification opens up risks, of course, but in my view, the perfect data set would also open up risks. So
if the grapes were at 84% or 91%, it would still get a red light. So my third question is, if we step back a little bit, and the data is not that accurate, but the outcome is still a red light for grapes and a green light for the avocados, does the accuracy of the data really matter?
Depends what you want to eat.
Yeah.
Like you might really just want those grapes, and that's a personal choice. It might, because it's not just down to data, is it? It's down to taste and down to.
Well, then that takes me back to the first question: was here's your perfect data set. How does it change the world?
I think that's the question, though. This often goes to the consumer is somehow going to solve it. This consumer will solve it. That has never happened yet. And so I think when you look at it in terms of consumer with regulation, with essentially strong incentives, then you can get more. You can actually see greater change. The most effective examples of labeling have come from appliance regulations, and it's been very effective. If you look at programs in the EU or in the United States, they're literally like gigawatts of energy and gigatons of carbon saved because of these programs. But that was a combination of incentives, rebates, market access, consumer education, clear value proposition tied into that savings of electricity. So that's the only example that we have right now with consumer labeling that has worked, and it was so much more than labeling. So it really requires a different way of engaging, and there's no perfect sustainability label or scorecard or stamp or red light or green light. That's not going to save the world. But if we can fundamentally change that so that every decision that changed from whether or not a product even ended up on a shelf, to how much you pay for it, to whether or not it should even be imported into the country, every decision is used to actually shape that, you can get to the system level changes that can really make significant change in emissions.
I'm still not there, I'm sorry. If we take a standard deviation curve with avocado down here and grapes over here, and then there's 2/3 of the stuff in the middle, because we're talking about stuff, right? Stuff creates carbon. Then the grapes would require a more complicated algorithm to work out that they would be illegal to import. But the 2/3 in the middle, and the avocado would be quite a simple algorithm to say that they can be allowed because it's grown locally, whatever. The 2/3 in the middle it doesn't seem to me that it requires, first of all, I'm a data accuracy guy. That's my entire mission in life. But this seems like a scenario that where the best is the enemy of good. And so my fourth question is, I've got a customer with 300,000 products. We could add a algorithm to their 300,000 products. That would be a reasonable indication, and it would be perfected over time. That could be, but that would indicate a carbon cost that could lead to a traffic light system. And that would be deriving data, which I'm generally against, but derived data has its purposes. What then? How would that? Because essentially it's going to come down to some sort of traffic light system in the end, I would imagine.
You, sir, have just explained product environmental footprinting in Europe, which will be the largest regulatory system on this.
Sorry, say.
Product environment, what you've just described is product environmental footprinting in Europe, which will be the largest product regulatory labeling system known to man. And so that is coming in some form. It may be late, it may be delayed, but there are systems like what you just described that are on their way.
This doesn't sound like a complex problem to me. It sounds like an algorithm.
It's taken 12 years to derive the regulation, and probably will take 6 more. So it's coming.
But isn't the bigger problem the cost of these things and accessibility? So, being an avid follower of the spot market of avocados in New Zealand, I may not be able to access financially the golden green light. And I think this green premium is still a huge issue in terms of people trying to actively follow a decarbonisation lifestyle or use the data to come in, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's the access to the level of detail of data as well. So because of the cost of trying to do a product lifecycle analysis, excuse me, and the challenge in scaling that up so that we can actually do that across like all products and not generically and with averages, but actually, there's a real scaling challenge, which I'm really interested in getting Christine's view on. We see that as a major barrier because right now it's only premium type providers that will go through a product LCA, and then they're just doing that if they think they're already probably, it's my view, already doing quite well and they want to differentiate from the average. But then when is the bad, version of the product ever going to get assessed as well? So there are big barriers there to actually getting assessment done. And then that probably comes back to like, what's the right level of detail? But there still needs to be trust in the numbers as well.
And LCA, sorry for the
life cycle analysis for product.
Christine.
Yeah, I think, as you say, there is a balance between getting it perfect and getting it to a level where average assumptions are made specific enough to that specific product, and looking at which parts of the life cycle will make a difference for that specific product. So yeah, I completely see the point. It is a very long process and it requires a lot of data to be inputted. So I guess that's also the reason why it took so long to get us where we are, because lifecycle assessments are kind of a lot of inputs specific to that one product, and it needs to be kind of specific to that supplier and their specific product. So a ton of cement product produced by supplier A will have a completely different impact to supplier B in a different country. So
why is that? Because there will be some baseline stuff that's the same.
Exactly.
And there'll be some stuff that's different. So what would be the stuff that's different?
Okay, cement was not a great example. Let's use maybe a different one. For example, what's different if you produce something in New Zealand compared to Australia is the electricity grid mix. In New Zealand, we have a really high percentage of renewable electricity. In some states in Australia, it looks a little bit different. More coal is burned. So the emissions per kilowatt hour and then the amount of kilowatt hours that are used to produce a specific product just needs to be specific to the country, for example. And then obviously there are a lot of different manufacturing processes to produce the same product. For example, steel can be made in an electric arc furnace or in a blast furnace. Again, emissions related to these two processes will be very different. And I guess that's the point where we're looking at taking an average emission factor for an electricity intensive product or for a ton of steel, just depends on where was it made and how was it made, how was it transported, how was it treated, or what do we assume what is going to happen at the end of the life. So while I see that we're all surprised that it took so long to get good data and make it mandatory, actually when you look at it, it can make a really big difference, taking into account these different factors. And if we want to make a decision, I think it's important to consider these differences. And just maybe on your question, combining the two questions that were raised, I think if we had the perfect data, we could give board members just the confidence to make decisions now on where to decarbonize first. Where do they put the money first, as in next year, in the next financial year, in order to decarbonize, to achieve their targets. So I think the perfect data would be amazing to have right here to just ensure boards and decision makers that, you know, that's the biggest bang for the buck.
Have I used up all my questions?
Pretty much, but you can slide one there and we'll go to wrap.
Let's do a deep dive into the steel. That's a really good example. If you take the life cycle of, let's say we have two steel manufacturers in China, and one uses an arc furnace and the other uses a blast furnace. But if you take into account the entire life cycle of getting that steel to New Zealand, what is the difference? So one might be require double the carbon. Let's say the blast furnace requires double the carbon than the arc. But when you take into account the entire life cycle of sand to furnace to New Zealand, it might be 80. It might have a score of 80 and a score of 90. So then that's
correct.
Relatively similar. In which case they would both get an orange light or whatever.
Yeah, now that is a really good example. Don't quote me on the numbers. I'd say transport makes less than 5% for steel. So it doesn't really matter how long you transport it because it's shipped. Ship has, you know, per ton kilometer, really low emission factor. Steel in the making has huge emissions. So, yeah, it's like, you know, that's why we need to look into that. I think that just, your question just confirms the complexity that we're having in getting data super accurate and why sometimes using average data is just the best we can do, but doesn't really take these nuances into account. So, yeah, good question.
A lot of challenges ahead of us.
Can I just make a basic statement or maybe a clarification and a type of question? Because of the indicators, which also are affected by the political will and the culture and the identity of the people in particular countries, how much would you say that would have major influence on, one, data being available, and also then how you can implement that to bring about the changes that you want? Because often culture and political things here very different to other countries.
Interesting question.
I think, I mean, this we've seen with consumer testing, and the context matters, the market matters, the culture matters, all of that, and that's why I think there's been a desire to just have one seal, label, metric to rule them all. And I think what generally the testing has shown is that's probably not going to work. Because what matters in Spain is different than what matters here in New Zealand, which is different than what matters in California, and that's where essentially there's a real need for innovation, for flexibility, because what's ultimately going to move decision makers, whether they're consumers or whether they're business people, may be different.
I think that's a really good place to line up. It's still a lot of questions to be answered, but I think we definitely got some insights that are useful in terms of just figuring out where we're at, and some optimism too about where we're headed and the fact that we can still make some change. So Brian, Bernadette, Jason, Christine, I'd like to thank you for spending the time with us, and folks online, thank you, and our audience here. And yeah, it was great to get those insights, and really enjoyed hosting this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.